I never thought I'd be the kind of man who doubts his wife's every move, analyzing text messages and scrutinizing late-night work meetings. But here I was, at 52, watching my world slowly unravel like a sweater caught on a nail, one thread at a time, so subtle you barely notice until the whole thing falls apart. Alexandra and I had built what I thought was an unshakable foundation over 23 years of marriage. We had weathered the death of my parents, her battle with depression, and the challenges of raising our now adult son. I was the steady force in our relationship, CEO of a mid-sized tech company, reliable, perhaps predictable. She was the spark, the creative force that kept our life from becoming mundane. At least, that's what I thought until 3 months ago. The first crack appeared during our anniversary dinner at Le Petit Jardin. Alexandra wore that black dress that still made my breath catch, even after all these years. Her dark hair cascaded over bare shoulders, and the candlelight played across her face in ways that reminded me of our first date. But something was off. Her phone kept lighting up with notifications, and each time, she'd turn it face down with a slight tension in her jaw that I'd learned to read over the years. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just work stuff, Lucas," she replied, offering that smile that used to reassure me but now felt like a wall being erected between us. "The gallery's new exhibition is causing some headaches." I nodded, taking a sip of my Bordeaux to hide my unease. The gallery, her pride and joy for the past 15 years, had always demanded attention, but lately, it seemed to consume her. Late nights, weekend, emergency meetings, sudden business trips to art fairs. I'd supported it all, proud of her success in turning a small local venue into one of the city's premier contemporary art spaces. But then came the changes. Subtle at first, new clothes, a different perfume, gym sessions with a personal trainer named Marco. All perfectly reasonable for a woman approaching 50 who wanted to stay vibrant. Yet something in my gut twisted every time she mentioned Marco's name or came home flushed from their sessions. "You seem distant lately," I ventured, reaching across the table to touch her hand. She didn't pull away, but I felt a slight stiffness in her fingers. "I'm just tired, Lucas. The new exhibition is demanding, and you know how crucial this season is for the gallery." I did know. Just like I knew that her assistant, David, had called the house last week looking for her during one of her supposed late-night inventory sessions. The confusion in his voice when I told him she was at the gallery still echoed in my mind. That night, as we drove home in weighted silence, I caught her checking her phone again. The blue light illuminated her face, and for a moment, I saw something I'd never noticed before, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, private and secretive. It was the kind of smile she used to reserve for me. My friend James had warned me months ago. Over whiskey at our weekly poker night, he'd mentioned seeing Alexandra at Café Noir with a man he didn't recognize. "Probably just a client," he'd said quickly, noting my expression. But his eyes held something else, pity, perhaps, or concern. I pulled into our driveway, the security lights casting harsh shadows across our meticulously maintained front yard. The house, a colonial we'd renovated together over the years, suddenly felt like a stage set, our lives a performance of domestic bliss that was starting to show its cracks. "I was thinking," Alexandra said as we entered the foyer, slipping off her heels, "I might need to go to the Miami Art Basel this year. The connections would be invaluable for the gallery." I watched her walk up the stairs, her movements graceful and practiced. Miami Art Basel was in 2 weeks. She'd never mentioned it before tonight. Later, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. The moonlight filtered through our bedroom window, casting patterns on the ceiling that seemed to mock my insomnia. I thought about checking her phone, it would be easy enough. The passcode was our son's birthday, or at least it used to be. But that would make it real, wouldn't it? Once you start down that road of suspicion and investigation, there's no going back. I rolled over, studying her profile in the dim light. She was still breathtakingly beautiful, perhaps more so now than when we'd met. Success had given her a confidence that drew people to her like moths to flame. I wondered, with a hollow feeling in my chest, if I'd become too familiar, too comfortable, too predictable. The next morning, as I prepared for an early board meeting, I noticed a business card that had fallen from her purse. Marcus Wells, Art Acquisition Specialist, it read, with a handwritten number on the back. The paper was thick, expensive, and slightly worn at the edges, not new, then. How long had she been carrying it? As I headed to the office, the morning traffic crawling along the highway, I made a decision. I'd built my company on calculated risks and trust in my instincts. Those instincts were screaming now, and for the first time in our marriage, I decided to listen. I pulled out my phone and called an old college friend who'd become a private investigator. "Hey, Mike," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my gut. "I need your help with something." Discreetly. The line crackled with a moment of silence before he responded, "Sure, Lucas. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, watching the city skyline emerge through the morning haze. "I need you to look into someone for me. Two people, actually. A Marcus Wells, and my wife." The words felt like acid in my mouth, but as I said them, I knew there was no turning back. The threads of my life were unraveling, and I needed to know how far the damage went before everything fell apart completely. "Come by my office this afternoon," Mike said, his tone professional but tinged with understanding. "We'll talk details." As I hung up, my wedding ring caught the morning light, sending a sharp reflection across my dashboard. 23 years of trust, about to be put to the test. I just hoped I was wrong about everything. But deep down, in that place where truth lives regardless of what we want to believe, I knew I wasn't. Mike's office felt like a confessional, dark wood paneling, Venetian blinds casting striped shadows across his desk, and the kind of silence that invites secrets to surface. I sat across from my old friend, watching him scroll through surveillance photos on his laptop, each click of his mouse like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of my marriage. "You were right about the Art Basel thing," Mike said, his voice carefully neutral. "But she's not going to Miami." My fingers tightened around the armrests. "Where?" "New York." He turned the laptop toward me. "She booked a suite at the Plaza under the gallery's corporate account. But here's the thing, she booked it for two." The photos started innocent enough, Alexandra entering the gallery, meeting with clients, everything normal. Then came the ones that made my stomach turn. Marcus Wells. Distinguished, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from old money and expensive education. The camera caught them at Café Noir, the same place James had spotted them. Their body language spoke volumes, the slight lean toward each other, her hand brushing his arm, their shared laughter intimate and conspiratorial. "There's more," Mike said, hesitating. "The personal trainer, Marco. He's not what you think. He's been feeding information to Wells about your schedule, your business trips. They've been coordinating around your absences." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marco, the guy I'd been paying $200 an hour to help my wife stay fit, the same guy I'd tipped generously every Christmas. The betrayal was so perfectly orchestrated it was almost admirable. "How long?" My voice sounded strange, distant. "Based on electronic communications. At least 6 months. Maybe longer in person." Mike leaned back, studying me. "Wells isn't just an art dealer, Lucas. He's made a career of acquiring valuable assets, including other people's wives. There's a pattern." I thought about Alexandra's recent changes, not just the physical ones, but the emotional withdrawal, the subtle reshaping of her personality. Had I been watching her being methodically transformed, sculpted by another man's influence? The thought made bile rise in my throat. That evening, I maintained our normal routine with mechanical precision. Dinner, casual conversation about our days, the practice dance of a long-married couple. Alexandra mentioned the upcoming New York trip casually, as if it were an afterthought. The timing's not great with the Morrison contract, she said, serving the salmon she'd prepared. But David can handle things here. David, her assistant who'd called looking for her during her supposed late-night inventory. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He wasn't just an employee, he was a convenient alibi. You should go, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice remained. The gallery needs these connections. She smiled, that same private smile I'd noticed in the car, and I wondered how I could have been so blind. The woman across the table was both achingly familiar and completely foreign, like looking at a perfect replica of a painting you've loved for years, only to realize it's a forgery. Later that night, I sat in my home office, reviewing the detailed report Mike had prepared. Wells had a methodology, a pattern he'd repeated at least 3 times before. He targeted successful, attractive women in their late 40s or early 50s, usually married to business-focused men. He used the art world as his hunting ground, slowly inserting himself into their lives through a combination of cultural sophistication and calculated seduction. The rage I felt wasn't hot, it was ice-cold, crystallizing my thoughts into sharp, clear patterns. In business, I'd learned that emotion was useful only when properly channeled. Now, watching the security footage Mike had obtained of Alexandra and Wells entering an upscale hotel, I felt that same clinical detachment I'd experienced during hostile takeovers. My phone buzzed, a text from Alexandra, working late tonight. Don't wait up. I checked the GPS tracker Mike had placed on her car. She was at the Atherton Hotel downtown, the same one from the surveillance photos. My hands didn't shake as I poured myself 3 fingers of scotch. I'd expected to feel devastated, broken. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if grief had burned away everything except pure, tactical thinking. I opened my laptop and began my own investigation into Marcus Wells. Mike had provided the outline, but I had resources of my own, connections built over decades in business, people who owed me favors. If Wells had a pattern, he also had vulnerabilities. Everyone did. A knock at my office door startled me. It was Mrs. Chen, our housekeeper of 15 years. Her expression told me she had something to say, something she'd been holding back. Mr. Lucas, she began, her voice soft but determined. There is something you should know. About Mrs. Alexandra and the man who comes when you are away. I listened as she detailed what she'd observed over the past months, the intimate lunches in the garden, the lingering embraces, the whispered conversations. Mrs. Chen's loyalty had always been to me. I'd helped her son get into college, had written the recommendation that secured his first job. He brings her gifts, Mrs. Chen said, pulling something from her pocket. I found this in the laundry last week. It was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. My dearest A, soon we won't need to hide. Trust in our plan. All my love, M. The words blurred as I read them, not from tears but from a surge of cold fury. They had a plan. Of course they did. And knowing Wells's pattern, it wouldn't end with just an affair. He was after something bigger, the complete acquisition of another man's life. I dismissed Mrs. Chen with heartfelt thanks and a significant bonus, then turned back to my computer. If they had a plan, I needed one of my own. The New York trip was in 10 days. That gave me time to prepare, to set my own pieces on the board. I pulled up my email and composed a message to my corporate security team, need complete background check on Marcus Wells. Priority level, immediate. Discretion essential. Then I sent another to my lawyer, need to meet first thing tomorrow. Bring everything you have on asset protection and corporate restructuring. As I worked into the night, I received another text from Alexandra, going to bed. Don't work too late. I smiled at my phone, the same private smile she'd been wearing lately. The game was on, but only I knew we were playing. And in games like this, the person who moves last usually wins. The scotch burned pleasantly as I swallowed the last sip, studying the photos spread across my desk. In one, Wells was looking directly at the camera, unaware he was being photographed. His expression was confident, predatory. He thought he was the hunter. I turned off my office light and stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Tomorrow, Alexandra would wake up and kiss me goodbye, heading to the gallery to finalize her New York plans. And I would kiss her back, play my role, and continue gathering the ammunition I needed. Because Marcus Wells wasn't the only one who knew how to acquire valuable assets. And he was about to learn a very expensive lesson about taking things that didn't belong to him. There's a peculiar clarity that comes with betrayal, a crystalline moment when pain transmutes into purpose. I found myself in that altered state as I sat in my corporate office, watching the morning sun paint golden rectangles across the mahogany conference table where I'd closed countless deals. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades of protecting business assets from hostile takeovers, I'd failed to secure what mattered most. My lawyer, Richard, spread documents across the table like a fortune teller laying out tarot cards. "Lucas," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years' friendship, "what you're proposing, it's elegant, but brutal. Are you sure?" I studied the corporate restructuring plans we'd spent the morning crafting. On paper, they looked innocuous, routine business maneuvers, the kind of financial choreography that happens every day in boardrooms across the country. But I knew their true purpose, an elaborate trap designed to spring shut at precisely the right moment. "Tell me more about Wells's previous patterns," I said, ignoring Richard's question. He sighed, pulling out another file. "3 cases we've confirmed." Each time, he positioned himself as a sophisticated confidant, an escape route from what he called golden handcuffs marriages. He helped each woman liquidate joint assets gradually, building up a nest egg for their eventual departure. But here's the pattern: once the money was moved, he would vanish, along with the assets. The configuration of Wells's predation was almost beautiful in its efficiency. He wasn't just a seducer, he was a financial vampire, bleeding out marriages and bank accounts with equal precision. Alexandra, with her gallery's success and her access to our joint accounts, must have seemed like the perfect target. My phone buzzed, a text from Mike, "Meeting confirmed. Wells had lunch with Sotheby's rep yesterday. Discussing private collection valuations." A cold smile played at my lips. Of course, the gallery's upcoming acquisition of the Morrison collection. Alexandra had been pushing for it for months, insisting we leverage personal assets to secure the deal. Now I understood why. "Richard," I said, "how quickly can we move on the restructuring?" 3 days for the preliminary paperwork." "But Lucas." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Have you considered just confronting her? A clean divorce? Your prenup is solid." I stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city I'd helped build. In my reflection, I barely recognized myself. Something had changed in my eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "This isn't about money," I said quietly. "It's about justice." Later that afternoon, I met with Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, now a rising star in corporate law. His loyalty to me was absolute. I'd mentored him since college, shaped his career with the same care I'd once devoted to nurturing my marriage. "The electronic trail is clear," Sarah said, his fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard. "Wells has been systematic. The gallery's corporate accounts show regular transfers to a shell company in the Caymans. Small amounts, nothing to trigger alerts. But over 6 months." He turned the screen toward me. The number made my teeth clench. Nearly $2 million, siphoned away in careful increments. Alexandra's emergency meetings had been more productive than I'd imagined. "The interesting part," Sarah continued, "is the timing. The large transfers started right after you mentioned the Morrison deal to her." I remembered that conversation, a quiet Sunday morning in bed, Alexandra tracing patterns on my chest as she spoke passionately about the collection's potential. I'd trusted her business instincts, proud of how she'd grown from running a small gallery to becoming a respected figure in the art world. Now I wondered how much of that growth had been orchestrated by Wells, grooming her, and our assets, for the taking. That evening, I maintained my routine with mechanical precision. Alexandra and I shared dinner, discussing her New York preparations. She'd grown careless in her confidence, letting small details slip. Marcus recommended a wonderful little place near the plaza for the client dinner, she said, reaching for her wine. He says the owner owes him a favor. I watched her hand tremble slightly as she lifted the glass. A tell, one I'd never noticed before. Was it guilt? Or excitement at how close she was to her endgame? Sounds perfect, I replied, spearing a piece of asparagus. The Morrison deal could really put the gallery on the map. Her eyes lit up at the mention of the deal, and I saw something predatory in her enthusiasm. My Alexandra, or rather, the woman who had replaced her, had learned well from her mentor. After dinner, I retreated to my study, ostensibly to work. Instead, I pulled up the dossier Mike had compiled on Wells's previous victims. 3 women, 3 ruined marriages, 3 disappeared fortunes. But he'd made a mistake this time. He'd chosen a target who understood predation from the other side. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number, info you requested on Plaza staff. Contact made. Everything in place. I deleted the message, then opened my personal safe. Inside lay a single USB drive, an insurance policy I'd prepared years ago when a competitor tried to hostile take over my company. It contained enough digital weaponry to destroy a person's financial existence. I'd never used it, the mere threat had been enough. Now, studying it in my palm, I felt a strange sense of destiny. I'd created it to protect my business empire. How fitting that it would now serve to protect something far more personal. A soft knock at my study door made me look up. Alexandra stood there, wrapped in the silk robe I'd bought her last Christmas. The sight of her still made my heart ache, but now it was a different kind of pain, sharper, more focused. Coming to bed, she asked, her voice honey-sweet. Soon, I said, smiling. Just finishing up some details. She nodded, hesitating for a moment as if she wanted to say more. Then she turned away, her robe whispering against the doorframe. I wondered if she felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the gathering storm of consequences about to break over her carefully constructed plans. I turned back to my computer, pulling up the private investigator's latest surveillance photos. In one, Wells and Alexandra sat in his car, their faces close, intimate. Her expression was one I'd never seen before, hungry, almost feral with anticipation. Soon, my love, I thought, closing the file. Soon you'll learn the difference between a hunter and a predator. I began typing an email to my team, laying out the final pieces of my counterstrike. The New York trip was 5 days away. Wells thought it would be the beginning of his endgame. He didn't realize it would be the start of mine. In the quiet of my study, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal and the architecture of revenge, I felt that strange clarity again. Every deal I'd ever closed, every corporate war I'd won, had been preparation for this moment. Alexandra and Wells had orchestrated their symphony of deception perfectly. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail: in the world of predators, there's always a bigger beast. The night before Alexandra's departure for New York, I watched her pack with the detached fascination of a naturalist observing a dangerous species. Her movements were precise, choreographed, the careful folding of silk blouses she'd bought for the occasion, each one chosen with calculated effect. I recognized the predator's attention to detail, having employed it countless times myself in the corporate arena. "You're quiet tonight," she said, glancing up from her suitcase. The concern in her voice was perfect, practiced. I wondered how many times she'd rehearsed these moments of manufactured intimacy. "Just thinking about the Morrison deal," I replied, adopting the distracted tone she'd expect from the man she thought she knew, the predictable husband, too absorbed in business to notice his world crumbling. A lot riding on this week. She crossed the room to where I sat, her perfume, new, chosen for another man's pleasure, wrapping around me like elegant poison. Her fingers brushed my shoulder, and I felt my body respond with Pavlovian faithfulness to her touch. Even now, knowing everything, desire and revulsion tangled in my chest like mating serpents. "Everything will work out perfectly," she murmured, and I caught the double edge in her words, the hidden meaning that would have slipped past my former self like silk through grasping fingers. I reached up, covering her hand with mine, feeling the wedding ring I'd placed there 23 years ago. "I know it will," I said, and felt her slight tremor, mistaking my certainty for ignorance, my grip for affection. Later, lying beside her in the dark, I listened to her breathing change as she drifted into sleep. My mind wandered to the meeting I'd had earlier that day with Sarah Chen and my security team. The pieces were in place at the plaza, every employee from the concierge to the housekeeping staff had been carefully compromised, each one a lens through which I would watch their carefully orchestrated performance crumble. My phone vibrated silently under my pillow. Mike's message was brief: "Wells boarded private flight to Newark. Landing 3 a.m. Of course, he would be there waiting, setting the stage for their grand finale. I imagined him in the luxury of his private jet, sipping bourbon, reviewing the documents Alexandra had been steadily providing, account numbers, transfer authorizations, the careful groundwork for their planned evacuation of assets. The same documents that now led down paths I'd reconstructed, each one a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a trap of my own design. I slipped out of bed and went to my study, where the night air carried the weight of approaching storm. On my laptop, I pulled up the surveillance footage from Wells's previous conquests. 3 women, each one a variation on a theme, successful, elegant, trapped in marriages that had grown too comfortable. I studied their faces, before and after, watching the transformation from confident professionals to hollow-eyed survivors. But I wasn't interested in their expressions of devastation. I focused instead on Wells himself, on the precise moment in each sequence when victory softened his guard. There, in the footage of his last victim, Charlotte Winters. The exact instant when certainty made him careless, when the predator forgot to look over his shoulder. I opened my email, sending the coded signal that would initiate tomorrow's sequence of events. Each message innocent on its surface, yet part of an orchestration as precise as any symphony of seduction Wells had ever conducted. To the plaza's head of security, confirming Mrs. Harrison's privacy requirements for Suite 1103. To my private banker in Geneva, proceed with the transfer protocols as discussed. To Sarah Chen, green light on the Morrison documentation. Every response came back within minutes, my own carefully cultivated web of loyalty and obligation spinning into action. I felt a dark satisfaction, remembering Alexandra's words from dinner: "Marcus says the owner owes him a favor." How narrow their conception of power was, how limited their understanding of true influence. A sound from the bedroom made me turn. Alexandra stood in the doorway, sleep-rumpled and vulnerable in ways that made my chest ache with memories of simpler times. "Can't sleep?" she asked, and for a moment I saw a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes, or perhaps just a masterful performance. The lines between real and fabricated had blurred so completely, I wondered if even she knew the difference anymore. "Just reviewing some contracts," I said, closing my laptop. "Go back to bed, love. You have an early flight." She hesitated, and I saw something cross her face: doubt. Regret? But it passed quickly, replaced by that mask of loving concern she'd perfected. "Don't work too late," she said, turning away. "You need your rest too." I watched her go, remembering the early years of our marriage when such moments of midnight tenderness had been pure, untainted by layers of deception. Now each gesture was a move in a complex game of strategy, every word weighted with hidden meaning. Returning to our bedroom, I observed her settle back into sleep, her face peaceful in the ambient light of the city. Tomorrow she would board a plane to New York, believing she was flying toward freedom, toward a new life crafted from the ruins of our marriage. She had no idea she was actually heading toward a carefully constructed crucible of my own design. I thought of Wells waiting in New York, confident in his practiced routines of seduction and acquisition. He'd chosen Alexandra carefully, seeing in her the perfect combination of access and vulnerability. But his methodology had a fatal flaw. He targeted women married to men he viewed as docile creatures of habit, predictable businessmen too absorbed in their corporate worlds to notice the subtle art of their own destruction. He didn't understand that some of us wore our predictability like camouflage, that what he saw as vulnerability was merely the surface tension on deep waters. He was about to learn that his carefully honed instincts had failed him. Instead of an aging lion too comfortable to guard his pride, he'd challenged something far more dangerous, a predator who'd spent decades perfecting the art of appearing harmless. As I finally drifted toward sleep, my mind painted vivid images of the days to come. I saw the precise sequence of revelations I'd orchestrated, each one designed to strip away layers of certainty and control. I watched Wells's face in my mind's eye as his confidence crumbled, as the hunter realized too late that he'd wandered into another creature's killing ground. And Alexandra, my Alexandra. The woman who'd shared my bed for 23 years, who knew the terrain of my body but had never truly understood the landscape of my mind. She was about to discover that the man she dismissed as predictable had learned to cultivate beautiful monsters of his own. The last thought that crossed my mind before sleep claimed me was a quote from Nietzsche that seemed particularly apt, and if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. Tomorrow would reveal who had gazed longer, who had learned more from the dark depths of human nature. I fell asleep with a smile, knowing that in less than 24 hours, the real performance would begin. There's an exquisite agony in watching someone you love walk willingly into a trap of their own making. I stood in our bedroom, the morning light catching Alexandra's wedding ring as she made her final preparations for departure. That simple band of gold had once symbolized eternity, now it was just another prop in an elaborate theater of deception. "I'll call when I land," she said, kissing my cheek. Her lips were warm against my skin, and I wondered if Wells would taste my presence there later, an invisible mark of what was to come. I watched her car disappear down our tree-lined street, carrying her toward what she thought was her carefully orchestrated escape. Only when she was gone did I allow myself to fully inhabit the person I'd become, no longer the trusting husband, but something altogether more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. My phone buzzed, Mike's surveillance team confirming Alexandra's arrival at the airport. Then another, Sarah Chin reporting that the Morrison collection documentation was in place, every page a carefully crafted snare. The machinery of revenge hummed to life around me, each piece moving with the precision of a Swiss watch. I made my way to my home office, opening my laptop to the live feed from the plaza. Wells had arrived hours earlier, taking the ambassador suite 2 floors above Alexandra's reserved room. The camera caught him at breakfast, exuding the easy confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control. I studied his movements, the way he checked his phone, his slight smile at messages that must have been from Alexandra. There was something almost admirable in his composure, the refined predator's patience. He didn't know that every message they exchanged was now being routed through servers I controlled, each word catalogued and analyzed. Their digital foreplay had become a performance for my benefit, a grotesque intimacy I forced myself to watch, building my resolve. "Target in transit," came the text from Mike. "Package secured." The package was Alexandra's phone, lifted and cloned by one of Mike's team during her security screening, then returned without her knowledge. Every message, every photo, every desperate digital trace of her planned escape now flowed through my hands like water. I opened the file containing their recent exchanges. Everything's ready. The Morrison papers are signed. Perfect, my love. By this time tomorrow, we'll be celebrating our freedom. I smiled at their naivete. The Morrison collection, their linchpin, their excuse for moving millions, was about to become the instrument of their undoing. Sarah had done his work well, every document Alexandra had so carefully prepared was a legal tripwire, each signature a noose tightening around their collective neck. My phone rang. Richard, my lawyer. Lucas, the Swiss accounts are showing movement. They're starting the transfers. Let them run, I said, watching Wells on my screen as he straightened his tie, preparing for what he thought would be his moment of triumph. Everything goes according to plan. I pulled up another window, monitoring the financial choreography as it unfolded. Alexandra and Wells, thinking they were cleverly moving assets beyond my reach, were actually following a path I'd laid out weeks ago. Each transfer, each digital sleight of hand, led deeper into my labyrinth. A knock at my door, Mrs. Chen, her face grave. Mr. Lucas, a package came for you. Inside was a single USB drive, courtesy of a former employee of Wells's who'd proved surprisingly willing to share information about his previous conquests. The files it contained were damning, not just evidence of his pattern, but the raw aftermath, broken lives, shattered fortunes, the detritus of his careful predation. I loaded the files onto my laptop, each image and document another piece of armor against the lingering echo of Alexandra's goodbye kiss. This wasn't just about money anymore, or even betrayal. This was about justice, not just for me, but for every life this elegant monster had destroyed. My phone lit up with updates from the plaza. 12:47 p.m., Alexandra checks in. 1:15 p.m., Wells spotted in the lobby. 1:30 p.m., they meet, not in her room or his, but in the hotel's private art gallery, a detail that made me appreciate Wells's sense of theatrical irony. Through the gallery's security cameras, I watched their reunion. The way she melted into his embrace, the hunger in their kiss, the triumphant gleam in his eyes as he held what he thought was his latest conquest. They looked like lovers in a Renaissance painting, beautiful, doomed, captured in the moment before divine retribution. Shall we begin? I texted to Sarah. His response was immediate, all systems go. Trap is set. I opened my email and sent the trigger message that would start the cascade, execute Morrison protocols. Within minutes, the carefully constructed framework of their escape began to disintegrate. First, the gallery's accounts froze, not obviously, but in subtle ways that would only become apparent when they tried to complete their planned transfers. Then, one by one, the offshore accounts they'd established began shutting down, each closure triggering alerts to financial authorities about suspicious activities. Through it all, I watched them on the security feeds. They moved through their day like dancers performing a familiar routine: lunch at the hotel's five-star restaurant, a private showing of art pieces that would serve as cover for their financial maneuvers, intimate touches and knowing smiles that spoke of victory too soon claimed. At 4:30 p.m., exactly as predicted, Wells left Alexandra to make what he told her was a crucial call to their contacts in Geneva. I watched him pace his suite, his composed facade cracking as he received news of the first financial irregularities. His calls became more frequent, more urgent. The predator was sensing that something was wrong, but couldn't yet identify the threat. Alexandra, meanwhile, was in her own room, preparing for what she thought would be their celebration dinner. I watched her choose a dress, new, bought specially for him, her movement still confident, unaware that her carefully constructed exit was already burning around her. My phone buzzed one final time. Phase 2 ready. Awaiting your command. I stood at my office window, watching the sun set over the city I'd helped build. In New York, Alexandra and Wells were about to discover the true meaning of betrayal. Every document, every account, every carefully laid plan was about to transform from an escape route into evidence. The monster I'd become smiled at its reflection in the darkening glass. Execute, I texted back. And in the gathering darkness, I waited for their world to burn. There's a particular silence that descends in the moments before an avalanche, when the world holds its breath before everything changes. I felt that silence in my bones as I stood in the plaza's lobby, watching Alexandra and Wells through the subtle lens of security cameras, their last perfect moments suspended in digital amber. They sat in the hotel's exclusive restaurant, the soft lighting casting romantic shadows across their faces as they toasted their imagined victory. Alexandra wore the black dress she'd packed so carefully, her neck adorned with the pearls I'd given her on our 20th anniversary. Wells leaned in close, his hand covering hers on the table, their intimacy a performance for an audience they didn't know they had. I waited until their main course arrived, giving them time to savor the taste of anticipated triumph. Then I sent the text that would begin their unraveling, execute final sequence. The maitre d' approached their table first, his practiced smoothness masking the calculated nature of his interruption. "Mr. Wells, there's an urgent call from Geneva at the front desk." I watched Wells's face change, subtle shifts that only a predator would recognize in another predator. The slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his spine. He squeezed Alexandra's hand, murmuring something reassuring before following the maitre d' to the front desk. Through my earpiece, I heard the conversation that awaited him, a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. His Swiss banker, calling with news that would shatter his carefully constructed world, accounts frozen, transfers reversed, regulatory flags raised. The cool professional voice outlined the catastrophe in precise terms, each word a bullet in Wells's armor. "Sir, we're required by law to report suspicious patterns of activity. The authorities have been notified." I switched camera views, watching Wells's composure crack like fine porcelain under a hammer. His hand gripped the desk, knuckles white with suppressed panic. This was the moment I'd orchestrated, when the hunter realized he'd become the prey. But it was only the beginning. In the restaurant, Alexandra's phone chimed with an email notification. I knew its contents without needing to see her screen, a detailed report from the gallery's board of directors, outlining the discovery of financial irregularities, unauthorized transfers, and potential criminal liability. Every document bore her signature, every transaction traced back to her authorization. The Morrison collection, her dream project, had become the sword of her own execution. I watched her face as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks as realization dawned. She looked up, searching for Wells, but he was already in motion, not toward her, but toward the elevator. The security feed showed him jabbing the button repeatedly, desperation breaking through his polished facade. It was time. I stepped out of the security office, adjusting my tie. 23 years of marriage had taught me Alexandra's rhythms. I knew she would head for Wells's suite, seeking explanations, reassurance, the comfort of their shared delusion. The elevator doors opened as I rounded the corner, and there she was. The moment crystallized like a photograph, Alexandra, half risen from her chair, her face a masterpiece of dawning horror. Wells, frozen in the elevator doorway, his mask of sophistication cracking to reveal the cornered animal beneath. And me, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, the husband they'd underestimated transformed into the architect of their destruction. "Lucas." Alexandra's voice cracked on my name. "What, how?" "Good evening, darling." I kept my voice soft, reasonable, the voice of board meetings and quarterly reports. "I believe you and Marcus have some explaining to do." Wells recovered first, his predator's instincts surging through the panic. "Lucas, this isn't what you think." "No, Marcus," I cut him off, "this is exactly what I think." "Shall we discuss your pattern? Charlotte Winters? Rebecca Hamilton? Or perhaps Sarah Morrison, the original owner of the collection you and Alexandra were planning to use as your escape vehicle?" I pulled out my phone, displaying the video compilation Mike had prepared, Wells with his previous victims, the same rehearsed moves, the same practiced seduction. Alexandra's face crumpled as she watched, each image a nail in the coffin of her planned escape. "The interesting thing about predators," I continued, my voice carrying in the hushed restaurant, "is that they rarely look up. They're so focused on their prey, they forget to check for larger hunters." Security guards materialized at each exit, not hotel staff, but my own team, positioned weeks ago. On the restaurant screens, financial news began to scroll, breaking stories about suspicious art market transactions, regulatory investigations, the sudden collapse of Wells's carefully constructed financial empire. "Your offshore accounts are frozen," I informed them, savoring the way Wells's face contorted. "Every transaction you've made in the past 6 months has been flagged for investigation. The gallery's board meets tomorrow to discuss criminal charges." "And the Morrison collection?" I smiled, feeling the weight of victory. "Those documents Alexandra signed? They don't actually transfer ownership of the art. They confess to a sophisticated attempt at fraud." Alexandra swayed, gripping the back of her chair. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time?" "I knew everything," I confirmed. "Every meeting, every text, every stolen moment you thought was secret. I watched you plan your escape, watched you fall into his pattern, watched you become another link in his chain of destruction." I turned to Wells. "But you chose the wrong mark this time. You thought you were hunting in safe waters, didn't you? The predictable husband, too absorbed in his corporate world to notice the subtle art of his own destruction." Wells's hand moved toward his jacket, reaching for his phone, I presumed, some last desperate attempt at damage control. One of my security team stepped forward, a quiet reminder of his powerlessness. "Don't bother," I said. "Your phones, emails, all your communications, they've been running through my servers for weeks. Every word you exchanged is now evidence. Every plan you made is a confession." The weight of it hit them both at once, the absolute totality of their defeat. Alexandra sank into her chair, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears. Wells stood rigid, his predator's mind visibly racing through options, finding none. "The authorities will be here soon," I informed them. "The Art Fraud Task Force is particularly interested in your previous cases, Marcus. It seems several of your former companions have decided to come forward." I stepped closer to Alexandra, close enough to smell her perfume, the scent I'd bought her last Christmas, now worn for another man's pleasure. 23 years, I said softly. "Did you really think I wouldn't fight for them?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw past the stranger she'd become to the woman I'd loved. "Lucas, please," she whispered. "I never meant to get caught. I finished for her. No one ever does." The elevator dinged, and federal agents stepped out, their badges catching the light. In the distance, sirens grew louder, the final movement in my symphony of destruction. I stepped back, watching as their world collapsed in orchestrated stages. Wells was taken first, his composed facade crumbling as the handcuffs clicked shut. Alexandra remained seated, shock rendering her motionless as agents began reading her rights. In the chaos that followed, I stood perfectly still, the eye of the storm I'd created. Reporters would arrive soon, tipped off through careful leaks, each one targeting a different aspect of the scandal. By morning, Wells's reputation would be in tatters, his other victims emboldened to come forward. The gallery's board would distance themselves from Alexandra, protecting their own interests. Every carefully constructed element of their planned paradise would become the instrument of their destruction. As I watched them being led away, I felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound, almost transcendent clarity. I had become what circumstances demanded, not the victim they'd marked me for, but something far more dangerous, a man who had learned to cultivate beautiful monsters of his own. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, not just for me, but for every life Wells had destroyed, every trust he'd shattered. Alexandra had been both accomplice and victim, corrupted by his influence but responsible for her own choices. I took the elevator to the hotel's rooftop bar, ordering a single malt scotch. Below, police lights painted the street in alternating red and blue. 23 years of marriage had ended tonight, but something else had been born, a version of myself that neither Alexandra nor Wells had seen coming. The scotch burned pleasantly as I lifted it toward the city lights. "To paradise lost," I murmured, and drank to the ashes of what once was, and the hard-won wisdom of what I'd become.